I've never been hunting in the winter, but this year I decided to try it. Something about the challenge of tracking deer through snow-covered woods felt appealing, pitting myself against nature at its harshest. I figured it would be tough, but rewarding. What I didn't expect was that this trip would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. My name is Jake Calloway, and this happened in Montana, deep in the Bitterroot National Forest. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months, a solo hunting trip deep in the woods, away from work, phone calls, and the constant noise of everyday life. Just me, my rifle, and the quiet solitude of nature. The cabin was exactly what I was hoping for, small, rustic, and completely isolated. The rental listing had described it as off the grid, with no cell service and only a basic generator for power. That was fine by me. I wasn't planning on streaming movies or checking emails. The drive out had been long, nearly 4 hours from the nearest town, mostly down winding dirt roads with barely any signs of life. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the thick forest surrounding the cabin. It was perched at the edge of a small clearing, an old wooden structure with a covered porch and a stack of firewood beside the door. There was a creek nearby for water, a shed for storing supplies, and enough distance from civilization to guarantee a peaceful weekend. I unloaded my truck, stashing my gear inside. The interior was simple. One main room with a cot, a wood stove, and a table with a couple of chairs. There was a small kitchen area with a propane burner and a shelf stocked with basic supplies. A single door at the back led to a tiny bathroom with an old, rust-stained sink. Nothing fancy, but more than enough for what I needed. That first night, everything felt normal. I cooked a quick meal, double-checked my gear for the morning hunt, and settled in with a book. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I fell asleep easily, comfortable in the kind of darkness you only find in the wilderness. The next morning, I woke early, feeling refreshed. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the quiet hum of nature. I spent most of the day trekking through the woods, tracking deer and enjoying the solitude. I hadn't seen anyone else since I'd arrived. Not that I expected to, this deep in the woods. By the time I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, my legs were sore and my stomach was growling. I made dinner, cleaned my rifle, and sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. That's when I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, just before the tree line, the snow looked disturbed. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe. But when I stepped closer, I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were spaced too closely together, as if someone had been walking slowly. The impressions looked fresh, like they had been made sometime during the day while I was out hunting. A chill ran through me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old hiker had passed through at some point. It wasn't impossible. But something about the prints bothered me. They led up toward the cabin, but not away. Someone had walked up to the cabin while I was gone. I glanced around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees loomed dark and silent in the fading light. There was no movement, no sound beyond the rustling of leaves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went inside, locking the door behind me. It felt ridiculous. This was the middle of nowhere. Who would be out here? But as I looked around, I felt another small prickle of unease. My pack. It had been zipped up when I left. Now the top was open, slightly unzipped. I frowned. Had I left it like that? Maybe. I couldn't be sure. I did a quick check of my things. Nothing was missing, at least as far as I could tell. My rifle was still leaning against the wall, my gear all accounted for. Maybe I was overthinking it. Still, I made sure to keep my gun closer than usual that night. Sleep came harder this time. The cabin, which had felt peaceful the night before, now felt different. The stillness wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. My ears strained for any sound beyond the usual creaks of the old wood and the occasional gust of wind against the window. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, my body tensed, before my mind even registered why. Silence. Not just normal nighttime silence, the kind where the world seems to be holding its breath, the kind that feels unnatural. I listened, heart pounding. Then the faintest creak, the kind wood makes when weight is slowly shifted onto it. It was coming from the porch. Someone was out there. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping tightly around the stock. My breath was shallow, my pulse thudding in my ears. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, and then after a few moments the sound stopped. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything at all. Finally, as dawn's first light crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, I found the courage to step outside. The footprints were still there, only now there were more of them. And this time, they weren't just near the tree line, they were on the porch. Whoever had been watching me had come closer, much closer. I stood on the porch, staring down at the footprints in the snow. My breath hung in the cold morning air, my pulse hammering in my ears. The prints were fresh, too fresh. Someone had been standing right here, just feet from where I slept. I scanned the tree line, my grip tightening on my rifle. Nothing moved, no birds, no wind, just an eerie silence settling over the clearing. I crouched and took a closer look. The footprints were deep, heavier than the ones from yesterday. Whoever had made them had stood there for a while, long enough to press the snow down into hard-packed impressions. Then I noticed something worse. The prints didn't just stop at the porch. They circled the cabin, a slow, deliberate path around the structure, as if someone had been walking the perimeter, watching from different angles. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to think logically. Maybe some local hiker was lost and looking for shelter. Maybe it was another hunter passing through. But why wouldn't they knock? Why come so close and not announce themselves? I needed to get out of there. I threw open the cabin door and rushed inside, locking it behind me. My bag was packed already. I just needed to load up my truck and leave. I wasn't going to spend another night here. I hurriedly stuffed my rifle case, my supplies, and my gear into my pack. My hands trembled as I reached for my keys. And then I stopped. Something was wrong. My keys weren't there. I checked the table, the cot, the floor. I turned over my pack, dumped out my pockets. But they were gone. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. I always left them in the same spot, right next to my pack, on the wooden table. I hadn't moved them. Someone else had. My eyes darted to the door. The locks were still in place, but that didn't comfort me. Someone had been inside while I slept. They had been close enough to take my keys. And I hadn't heard a thing. A metallic taste filled my mouth as panic crept in. I forced myself to think. The truck was still outside, but without my keys, I wasn't going anywhere. I needed to check if the vehicle was still intact. I grabbed my rifle and cracked the door open, stepping cautiously onto the porch. My boots crunched in the fresh snow as I moved toward the truck. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires had been slashed. A wave of cold nausea rolled over me. Whoever had been watching me didn't just want to scare me. They wanted me to stay. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the slashed tires. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, fogging the icy morning air. This wasn't some accident. This wasn't an animal. Someone did this. I forced myself to move, my fingers tightening around my rifle as I circled the truck. All 4 tires slashed clean through. Deep cuts, precise. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. I scanned the area, my eyes flicking toward the tree line. The same eerie stillness from the night before hung over the clearing. No movement, no sound, but I could feel it. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I needed a plan. My truck was useless and my keys were gone. The only way out now was on foot, but I was miles from the nearest road, deep in the Montana wilderness. It would take hours to hike back to civilization, if I even made it that far. Number I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without knowing what I was dealing with. I took a slow breath, forcing down the panic clawing at my throat. Think. Stay calm. Whoever did this wasn't expecting me to fight back. They thought they had me cornered. They were wrong. I turned back to the cabin, moving quickly but keeping my head on a swivel. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I pushed the fear down. I had weapons, supplies. This was my ground, not theirs. Inside, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and grabbed my hunting knife, strapping it to my belt. My rifle was already loaded, but I double-checked the chamber anyway. If someone came through that door, I wasn't going down without a fight. I moved to the back of the cabin and dragged the heavy wooden dresser in front of the door. It wouldn't stop someone determined, but it would slow them down. Then, I killed the lights and crouched near the window, peering through a small gap in the curtain. I waited. Seconds turned to minutes, then an hour. The forest remained unnervingly silent. No birds, no wind, just the distant hum of my own pulse in my ears. And then, movement, a flicker of motion near the trees. I held my breath, gripping my rifle tighter. There, a figure, just beyond the tree line, standing perfectly still. They were too far away to make out details, but I could see the outline, tall, bulky, wearing dark clothing. They weren't moving toward me. They weren't walking away. They were just standing there, watching. A fresh surge of fear shot through me, but I swallowed it down. I raised my rifle, resting it against the window frame. If they came closer, I wasn't going to hesitate. I waited. Minutes passed. The figure didn't move. Did they know I was watching them? Were they testing me? Then, without warning, they took a step backward. Then another. Slowly, deliberately, they disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. I exhaled shakily, my body still wired with tension. What the hell was this? If they wanted to attack, they had their chance. Instead, they stood there, long enough for me to see them, long enough to let me know they were real. Whoever they weren't done yet. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, gripping my rifle, waiting for the next move. And I knew this wasn't over. I didn't sleep. I stayed crouched by the window, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had vanished. Hours passed and the darkness outside remained still, but that didn't comfort me. I knew they were still out there, watching. At some point, exhaustion took its toll, and I must have drifted into a light, uneasy doze. But then, a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I snapped awake, my breath catching in my throat. My hands tightened around the rifle. I wasn't dreaming. The sound was real. Another knock, louder this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to force their way in. They wanted me to answer. I forced my voice to stay steady. "Who's there?" Silence. For a long, unbearable moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the deep, suffocating quiet of the woods. Then, slow footsteps retreated across the porch, heavy boots crunching in the snow. Step by step, they moved away. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. What the hell was this? I waited until the footsteps disappeared completely before inching toward the window. My fingers trembled as I peeled back the curtain just enough to see outside. Nothing. No figure. No movement. The early morning light was beginning to creep over the snow-covered clearing, casting long, eerie shadows. But then, I saw it. Something pinned to the wooden railing of the porch. I squinted. It was a piece of paper, secured with a hunting knife. A fresh wave of unease tightened in my chest. I didn't want to go out there. Every instinct screamed to stay inside, to keep the door locked and the rifle ready, but I had to know. I moved cautiously, my rifle raised as I unbolted the door. The cold air rushed in, biting at my skin. I stepped onto the porch, every movement deliberate and slow. The paper fluttered slightly in the wind. I kept my eyes on the tree line as I yanked it free from the knife. There were no words, just a map, a hand-drawn path leading away from the cabin, deeper into the woods, and at the end of the path, a single black X. I stared at the crude drawing, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whoever left this wanted me to follow. I glanced back toward the forest. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with frost. There was no sign of movement, but I felt it, the weight of unseen eyes on me. I took a shaky breath, gripping the rifle tighter. Every part of me screamed to ignore the map, to barricade myself inside and wait this out. But I knew that wasn't an option. Whoever was out there wasn't going to stop. They'd already slashed my tires, stolen my keys, circled my cabin in the dead of night. This wasn't some lost hiker or curious hunter. This was a game, and I was the target. I stepped back inside, bolting the door behind me. I needed to think. Going into the woods alone was a risk, but staying here, trapped and waiting, felt worse. I had no way to call for help, no vehicle to escape in. My only advantage was that I was armed, and unlike whoever was out there, I wasn't playing. I studied the map again. The path wasn't far, maybe a 30-minute walk into the forest. The X could mean anything, a warning, a trap, a message, but something about it gnawed at me. Whoever left this wanted me to see it, wanted me to go. I clenched my jaw, my decision made. I wasn't going to be led like an animal to slaughter. If they wanted me to play their game, I'd play, on my own terms. I checked my gear, grabbed extra rounds, and tightened my grip on my rifle. If someone was waiting for me in those woods, I wasn't walking in blind. I was going in ready. I knew I was making a dangerous choice, but I also knew I had no other options. Whoever was out there had already proven they weren't just trying to scare me. They had slashed my tires, stolen my keys, circled my cabin, and now they were leading me somewhere. I wasn't going to sit inside waiting for whatever was coming next. If they thought I was going to walk into a trap, they had another thing coming. I grabbed my gear, double-checking my ammo and knife before stepping out onto the porch. The cold morning air burned my lungs as I exhaled, my breath clouding in front of me. The forest loomed ahead. The path from the hand-drawn map burned into my mind. It wasn't far, maybe half a mile. A short walk under normal circumstances. But this was anything but normal. I moved cautiously, rifle raised, eyes scanning the trees. The fresh snow muffled my steps, but every so often I'd stop and listen. Nothing. No wind, no birds, no rustling of branches. Just that unnatural stillness, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. 15 minutes in, I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. A tree marker. A strip of bright red fabric tied around a low branch, standing out like blood against the white snow. It hadn't been there before. Someone had put it there recently. I gritted my teeth and pressed forward. More markers appeared as I walked, pieces of cloth, scratches on tree trunks, small piles of stacked rocks. The deeper I went, the stronger the sense of wrongness grew. My pulse pounded in my ears. My grip on the rifle tightened. Then I saw it, the X from the map. A clearing opened up before me, the snow trampled down into messy footprints. In the center stood a large wooden box. No, not a box. A crate, the kind used for shipping, with metal reinforcements along the corners. The wood was old and splintered, but the lock on the front was new. Fresh steel, gleaming in the pale morning light. Something was inside. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. I took a cautious step closer, my boots crunching against the packed snow. Then, movement. A thud from inside the crate. I froze. My finger hovered over the trigger. Another thud, louder, then scraping, as if something was shifting, pressing against the wooden walls from within. I took another step, my breath hitching in my throat. What the hell was this? Then, a sound I wasn't expecting. A whimper. Low, pained, human. Someone was inside. I clenched my jaw, my mind racing. Was this a trap? A lure to get me close? I scanned the tree line. Nothing. But I felt it. The same unseen presence, watching, waiting. I had a choice. I could turn back, pretend I never saw this, barricade myself in the cabin and wait for whatever sick game this was to play out. Or I could open the crate. I took a deep breath, gripping my rifle tight. And then I reached for the lock. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the lock. Whoever, or whatever, was inside that crate was alive. I had no doubt about that now. The whimper had been faint, barely audible, but it was there. Someone was trapped in this box, and whoever put them here wanted me to find them. I scanned the tree line again, every nerve in my body on high alert. The feeling of being watched was suffocating now. My instincts screamed that this was a trap, but what choice did I have? If I walked away, I might be leaving someone to die. I tightened my grip on my rifle, bent down, and inspected the lock. Brand new. Solid steel. Whoever did this hadn't expected me to break it easily. I wasn't about to play their game. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, grabbed my hunting knife, and wedged the blade beneath the lock's hasp. With a sharp twist, I forced the tip into the gap and pried hard. The metal resisted at first, then with a sharp snap, the latch gave way. The crate shuddered. Something inside jerked violently, making the whole thing rattle. I stumbled back, raising my rifle again. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then, silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that sent a cold wave of dread rolling over me. Slowly, cautiously, I reached forward and lifted the lid. Inside was a man, pale, shivering, his face gaunt and sunken. His clothes were torn, his wrists raw and tied together with thick rope. His lips were cracked and his eyes, wide, terrified, locked onto mine with a desperate intensity. He opened his mouth, but his voice was hoarse and weak. "They're still here." My blood turned to ice. I spun around, rifle raised. The woods were still, empty, but I felt them. They were watching. The man tried to move, struggling against the ropes. "Please, untie me." I turned back, my hands fumbling with the knots. The rope was stiff, frozen from the cold, but I yanked at it, my breath coming fast and sharp. Then a sound, a low, guttural whistle. Not from the man, from the trees. It echoed through the clearing, eerie and deliberate, like some kind of signal. My stomach dropped. The man in the crate went rigid. His eyes darted past me, widening in horror. I knew what that meant. I didn't look. I ran. I yanked him up by his arm, half carrying, half dragging him toward the path. He was weak, stumbling, barely able to move, but I didn't care. We had to get out. Now, the whistling stopped. Then, footsteps, fast, coming toward us. Branches snapped, snow crunched, the sound of multiple people, no, hunters, moving through the woods with practiced speed, closing in. My legs burned as I forced us forward, my breath ragged. I clutched my rifle, ready to turn and fire if I had to, but deep down I knew this wasn't a fight I could win. These people, whoever they were, they had been planning this, stalking me, setting this up, and I had walked right into it. The cabin came into view, a dark shape in the pale morning light. But something was wrong. The door was open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I hesitated, but there was no time. We barreled inside and I slammed the door shut, shoving the dresser back in place. The man collapsed onto the floor, gasping. His skin was clammy, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. I knelt beside him. "Who are they?" I demanded, my voice barely steady. "Who did this to you?" His eyes flickered to the window. "They don't let people leave." His voice was so faint I almost didn't hear him. Something thumped against the porch. A boot. A shadow fell across the window. I raised my rifle, my body coiled tight. This was it. But then, the sound of an engine. Distant at first, then growing louder. My truck. My goddamn truck. Headlights cut through the trees, and for the first time in hours, the woods weren't completely dark. The figures outside scattered, disappearing into the trees like shadows melting into the night. My truck roared to life, tires kicking up snow as it sped toward the cabin. Someone was driving it. I had no time to think. I yanked the man up, throwing his arm over my shoulder, and we ran. The truck skidded to a stop in the clearing. The driver's side door flew open and a man, a real hunter wearing an old camo jacket, jumped out, waving frantically. "Come on, move!" I didn't question it. We piled in, slamming the door shut. The driver hit the gas before I could even shut my door. The truck fishtailed on the icy road, the tires barely gripping, but we were moving, leaving the cabin, leaving the clearing, leaving whatever the hell had been waiting for us back there. I turned in my seat, breathless, my heart still slamming against my ribs. The cabin was just a speck now, a fading shadow in the trees, and standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the thinning darkness, were three figures, just standing there, watching. We didn't stop. We didn't look back again. The man I rescued, his name was Alan Parks. He had gone missing 6 days before I found him. The police questioned both of us, but there was nothing left at the cabin by the time they arrived. No footprints, no crate, no sign that anyone had ever been there. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. I don't know who those people were, or why they were out there, hunting, stalking, setting traps. But I do know this: they let me go, because I wasn't the one they wanted. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell to listen to new stories from Mr. Fear every day. Also, please write in the comments what state you are listening to this story from. Thank you for watching.